everyone. I'm Stefan Bertram, and because Ben was away last week and Ben is also away this week, we didn't want to completely sabotage what we have going on here. So this week we have a very special, great first comment. This week we have a special guest episode with Doug Lain.
Hello.
A man who needs no introduction, at least in the very small spaces that we run in.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel called Sublation Media. I used to run Zero Books and got kicked out of there. I've written novels, and there's my introduction.
And recently, you've been posting a lot about free speech and censorship and state censorship. And it's not just you. We've had a lot of stuff going on with speech. Ben Burgess has, Pon says, White Guy Sunday. Ben Burgess has just published an article in the Daily Beast, where he puts across the idea that regardless of the motives of this guy who's leaked these secret Pentagon documents, what he did was a good thing, and actually it is good to leak this thing. You are currently writing an article for Unheard on the topic of updating Noam Chomsky's
manufacturing consent.
Ideas of manufacturing consent, and you're someone that's been very concerned with the Twitter files. So today is going to be about the philosophy and the principles first, but it is good to locate things first in the actual goings on. If I wanted not to talk about the principles, but just wanted to get you really triggered, I'd start the day asking you a question like, so Doug, I've seen you posting on Twitter about Elon Musk and the Twitter files and free speech and vaccines and Fauci. So you're right wing now, right?
Oh God,
something like that.
Yeah, something like that would get me started. First of all, the idea that we should be very concerned about free speech and protecting people's individual rights and collective rights to speak and to politically organize is not a right-wing idea. This is foundational to socialism, to Marxism, and to I would just say modern democratic society. I mean, this is bedrock as far as I'm concerned. And look, I wanted to start by underlining the fact that we're talking about this issue. I'm going to read this. I wrote this all down. We're talking about this issue in the context of the exposure of a systematic and state-funded sustained effort to abridge legally protected speech across, quote, the whole of society. I'm quoting Department of Homeland Security pamphlet entitled Combating Targeted Disinformation Campaigns, a whole of society effort. The pamphlet was produced by a team that included members of the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security, along with 5 members from the corporate and NGO sector. And what they want to do is target disinformation campaigns, but disinformation is not a category of illegal speech within the United States.
Yeah, like I should be able to lie to people on the internet. It's fun.
Yes, right. You should be able to lie to people on the internet. That is legally protected speech. You should also be able to be wrong on the internet. That is legally protected. And it kind of gets to the foundation of the principle of free speech to consider why you should be able to do those things. And the primary reason why is because nobody has a monopoly on truth.
Right, because basically, if you say that misinformation should be got rid of, then there needs to be some absolute Noah, right? And I haven't seen God around lately. I don't think he works for the DHS.
Right. Although I'm sure some of them would disagree with you. Someone's calling me low energy Lain. Should I start shouting more?
I think you're normal energy, Lain. I think this is a good amount of energy. We don't want too much energy.
Yeah. So I mean, but I do think it's just important to underscore the fact that I feel as though over the last maybe half decade, but certainly now we're at a moment where we may be quietly acquiescing to the abandonment of the principle of free speech in society. And and what's been troubling me lately is the realization that a good portion of what it calls itself the left, in at least in the online sphere, um, doesn't seem troubled by this incursion of the state
Yeah,
in
I think because
online.
free speech was used as a cudgel by the right for so long, a lot of people on the left became very suspicious of it as a term. But regardless of how it is abused, the thing that we should remember is that it's a very important principle, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Well, I mean, we should talk a little bit about this idea that free speech was used as a cudgel. Um, by the right. I mean, I suppose many people on the right stood up and protested their being censored, like someone like Milo Yiannopoulos made a big deal out of being censored, and others. Um, but we should be careful to say that. I mean, that claim often enough, or some was often true, that people were being
Sure.
censored who were on the right, and there's no reason to abandon the principle of free speech, even for people who you despise, as you combat people politically. In fact, I think we are more often going to lose credibility when we do that, and also saddle up alongside established powers that are more than happy to abandon the
Right.
principle
I
of
mean,
free
if
speech.
if we accept the idea that people we don't like should not have free speech as a general kind of principle, then that means the far left is definitely not going to have the right to speak because the people who actually have power don't like us very much.
That's right. And the other thing is, for someone like me, the people I don't like, that list changes every day, like depending on my mood. So it would be bad and very erratic if I were to try to censor everyone I don't like. I think that might change by the hour. So yeah, that's anyhow. But you wanted to talk kind of about the about I guess John Stuart Mills, right? And the reasons why free
Well,
speech
I mean, yeah,
is
first I wanted to
important.
kind of try and talk about like what even is speech. Because, for instance, in the US Constitution, Americans legally have an absolutely crazy right, really, which is that that speech should in no ways be abridged. But obviously, there are things like when a mafia boss orders someone killed, who were like, well, that should be illegal in some way. And so, what US courts have done is try to make a distinction between speech and kind of action or something like this. Basically, like they say that what's going on when they make it illegal for someone to order someone's murder, even if they purely do that via speech, is that that isn't speech. That's something else, which isn't necessarily kind of. We, I think we could say rather that that is speech, philosophically speaking, but that doesn't mean that there can't be something done about it.
Right. I mean, in the United States, it's spelled out in law that there are like four exceptions for the state when they can intervene and limit or curtail speech. One is obscene material, and this is one that's hotly contested as to what counts as obscenity. Generally, I think historically, people on the left has tried to uh, work against those who would censor on the grounds of obscenity. There were, like William Burroughs novels were banned based on the obscenity laws, but that's one area where speech can be banned. And, the example of child pornography is, I think, an uncontroversial example of speech that should be curtailed. Plagiarism and the violation of copyright is another example where speech can be curtailed. Defamation or libel, that's difficult to establish, but that's another area where the state has some interest and can curtail speech. And then true threats
Mm.
is the final category, and that comes from John Stuart Mill's harm principle, I think, or it can be traced back to that.
We
Um,
defended using that regardless of the
yeah,
actual
yeah,
tracking.
right. And in on liberty, he says an opinion basically he says that an opinion that corn dealers are starvers. He gives the example of corn dealers. So corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed out among the same mob in the form of a placard. So, yeah, when you are inciting people to commit an act of violence on the spot immediately, not through
Yeah.
some roundabout chain of causation, but directly, that kind of speech can be curtailed and is illegal.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I did just want to say before we get into so much stuff about harm that there is like a lot of struggle to define. For instance, I think some people would not understand. For instance, when people know platform, but they don't know platform in the sense of they prevent the speaker from speaking before they start. But for instance, at my university, a long time ago, the Israeli ambassador came. And what people did to try and stop him, among other things, was they kind of got up in sequence and started to read out a prepared statement. And obviously, that is speech. That's a speech act. And I think that's something which should be protected, at least to some degree, as a right to kind of. And I think this is not something that's generally talked about in kind of bourgeois discussions around free speech. The idea that there should be some degree of a right to interruption, that there shouldn't be just because that person has been invited by the property owner or whatever, that their speech trumps everyone else's. But then later on, they triggered the fire alarm, which I think is probably not speech.
no, that's not speech. Um, Probably. But, my position would be to try to defend the rights of those protesters to interrupt, and to even, if to find them a good lawyer to defend their right to pull the fire alarm. And I recall actually my kids, when they were in university a few years back, uh, participated in a protest around uh, fee, tuitions going up, and other issues around making the university less accessible and more expensive. And they were protesting this, and they walked in on the president of the university while he was giving a lecture or speech, actually, to major donors, and disrupted it and walked up on stage and took the microphone. And uh, that, for a variety of reasons, the president of the college was able to call them out on the question of his free speech, having disrupted his free speech and not respecting basic, principles. And the reason why that had some rhetorical effectiveness was because uh, they had also been calling for Republican tables where they were giving out brochures to be kicked off campus because of
Right.
the offense that it caused and the harm that it caused to students who had to walk by and see a brochure or a poster arguing against abortion and that kind of thing. So that speech was considered harmful by the activists who had disrupted the president's uh, lecture. So there does need to be a consistency, and I do think that for many years, people who consider themselves to be radical leftists have sort of lost hold of the need for protected speech,
Yeah, I mean,
and more than that, just also the benefit of free and untrammeled speech. Like, we actually gain from hearing other people's opinions, even the opinions that we don't agree with or think that are offensive, because it, at the very least, tests our own ideas. And often, or more often than I like to think, when I talk to someone I disagree with, I discover that I was wrong about something, and I have to correct my opinion, which I always hate, but does happen.
yeah, and to go on to kind of harm stuff that you mentioned there and is mentioned in the chat, I think the that kind of Mill's harm principle, while the example he gives is again very bourgeois, and we can talk about some stuff regarding property rights and so on later on. But I think as a principle, it's fine. Like, yes, and this can this can ban both kind of the mafia murder order, as well as shouting in a theater, shouting fire in a theater, as well as kind of the kind of inciting a crowd to immediate violence or something like this. All those things can be covered by the harm principle.
Mm.
But what Mill meant at the time at least mostly or nearly entirely, was a concept of harm which is based on physical harm. But that is not the idea of harm we have now. That's a concept which has massively expanded, which is not to say that this makes the concept bad or worse or anything like that, but rather it has expanded in general use to encompass much more things. For instance, psychological harm, emotional harm, and this kind of thing. And in that circumstance, it's basically possible to ban any speech in at least some circumstances, which is something which almost basically goes on in the UK, where basically it's illegal here to offend.
How is that written up? What do they say particularly? Do they
Well,
list particular
often you
kinds
can
of?
get people for disturbing the peace.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically like the default law, which they can get everyone by in the UK. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how it goes, but basically in the UK, it's possible to get anyone for any kind of speech, though the police don't normally pursue it to actually convict someone. But you do get arrested in the UK for tweets, and not tweets saying "I'm going to kill the president," but kind of like racist tweets and things like this.
Right. Um, you know, Going back to Mills, he claimed, and I think rightly, that even the most grotesque or offensive or morally reprehensible arguments or ideas should not be censored by the state. So, the classic example is like the idea, if someone wants to write up a book about how it's healthy and beneficial and socially useful to eat babies, they shouldn't be stopped from doing so, according to Mills, because the taking up and thinking over of any idea, any set of arguments or principles, anything that has some cognitive content is for the good. It's not a waste of time. It's not a waste of time to argue with a flat earther. Most of us, including me, probably need to be refreshed on exactly why we know that the earth isn't flat, and what are what's the astronomical principles, what's some math involved in determining that it's
I
round.
just learned today about the Foucault's pendulum, which is a different Foucault to the philosopher and homosexual,
Mhm.
um, which is basically a pendulum which changes in its rotation based on the rotation of the Earth. So it's a way you can directly observe the rotation of the Earth while still being on Earth.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've heard of that before, and I'm sure it would be worthwhile to go over how that Foucault's pendulum worked in the context of a debate with some flat earther somewhere. Um, oh no. Well, damn it. I'm done. I got canceled yet again. Um, the other thing that in the United States is the case is that the government can't intervene and censor the press, or the operations of private organizations. So, um, you know, when it comes to free speech in private life or within institutions that are not state run, there are all sorts of limits that can be imposed on speech, um, and that isn't illegal. That isn't the kind of culture I'd want to live in, where everyone was so constantly concerned about being offended. But if you want to put together a private club and the rule is no one can say the word purple or they're ejected, or no one can defend the wearing of purple shirts while they're there, you have the right to do so, and that's not
Probably a real club in the 19th century.
probably. Yeah. Right. um uh and I'm looking up and seeing Derek Varn is in the
I've
chat.
pinned one of Vaughn's messages. I was just going to leave it because he was discussing the issue of public versus private speech, which I don't know if you want to cover now.
Yeah, which I kind of responding to a previous comment from Derek, which was I flattens the distinction between private and public speech. Well, I don't. I think I just overcame that. And again, the reason that I've been on such a tear lately, more than my usual sort of background grumbling about the need for upholding the idea of free speech and being less censorious in general, is because what I have discovered is a concerted, systematic effort to censor the whole of society, and that's their language, not mine.
Right.
That's coming out of a network of government agencies and NGOs working together.
Yeah,
So
who like basically email back and forth with Twitter, and be like, get this one.
yeah, well, right. But no, it's more sophisticated than that. It's like they gather up the data from the different social media platforms. They have computer algorithms. They have AI or machine learning evaluate the data. Then they go through that and create reports, and then they go and they train the social media employees as to what kind of disinformation is out there and what they need to be on the lookout for. And uh, in the case of the FBI, in the case of the FBI with the Hunter Biden laptop story, they had that laptop before Giuliani did. They were training Facebook employees and even meeting with Zuckerberg about the potential disinformation that was going to come in the form of this laptop story, uh, like I think a month in advance of it being published in the New York Post. So there is, not only attempts to censor things that are being written, but to censor things that might be written about. That stories
And
that means like the control information that the government knows about that they don't want us to know about. That there's no, it's not. This isn't classified information. It's just a matter of controlling the narratives that
I mean,
we
a very
found.
common kind of thing which is said by left liberals when Twitter would censor something would be to say that kind of your First Amendment rights are not being violated because this is not state action,
Right.
which, and obviously, as you kind of point out, there is this relationship here, but I think in a principled way, we shouldn't really be taking that so seriously anyway, to the degree that these places are not, in fact, like a private club where you can't wear purple. That's not something which Twitter is like. Twitter, as much as it's
Mm-hmm.
cringe to say, is to some degree like a heavily regulated by a private entity public square,
Mm-hmm.
which once you reach that kind of position, even with, I don't really worry too much about kind of law in bourgeois society, but it seems like those things have such an important role in kind of interrupting the flows of speech in bourgeois states and in contemporary bourgeois countries, that there should be some kind of special regime for these companies where they do have to follow something like the national law, like there is in the United States.
Well, what would be good about making, in a transparent way, making Twitter kind of a public entity or nationalizing Twitter would mean that
Which Corbyn suggested, a
right,
nationalized.
right. Nationalize Twitter, nationalize social media. It'd be difficult because these are international corporations, right? But the ones that have their corporate headquarters in the United States will be nationalized by the United States and so on. And it'd be very different how they operated based on the different laws in every nation. But in the United States, if it were nationalized here, then Twitter would have to uphold people's constitutional rights when they
Because
were
yeah, because I mean, it is the case that they do have to follow the law, but in like a negative way. Like in Turkey, they have to censor more than they do in the US. But it's,
right.
it's not the case in the US that they have to censor as little as is in the Constitution.
Well, actually,
They
I
can always do it more,
disagree.
but
I think that when it comes to censorship on a publicly run communications platform, um, for instance, like let's say YouTube, where you give everyone the opportunity to become their own creators and to run their own press off of this platform, right? Then to censor those creators would have to be restricted to the level by the by the state would have to be restricted by the Constitution. That which means that you would have to do some tinkering with how the algorithm worked to create a more neutral, uh, user by user driven system rather than a system where the platform itself is deciding what content people see. You would have to change the algorithm or change the programming.
But
But
like, what do you suggesting that there shouldn't be some kind of minimum condition? Like, for instance, should Twitter go along with Turkish censorship laws, or should they say no and take the ban?
no, I'm saying that in the United States, since Twitter is a U.S. company,
Right,
they should be bound by the terms of the U.S. Constitution.
right. Because
And
what
to go
what
further
often,
than that, though, to go
yeah,
further than that, right now, given the involvement of the Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, the CIA, and the FBI, Twitter is already a state actor. There's
right.
something called entwinement, and they are legally exposed to their users for litigation for the violation of these users' constitutional rights. Whether anyone will actually try to pursue it and what the courts will do is another matter. But there is, case law and principle to
So I think this
exclude.
is Derek Varner suggesting in the chat would be a good time to kind of think about this in a Marxist way, and in terms of Marxist principles, which is the final section I have in my show notes, which is kind of how does speech, especially in bourgeois society, relate to kind of property right and property ownership. And I think they are, and we probably agree that
Mhm.
they're intimately tied in such a
Right.
way that basically, actors at the top of our society do have an incredible amount of free speech, and that's good for them. But this isn't true for anyone else. And think like, people can talk about censorship on social media, but until very recently, there was no such thing. And what did you do in the '90s, Doug? You made fucking, what do you call them,
Cassette
pamphlets?
tapes
Yeah, yeah,
and
like,
and zines. I
right,
made little audio collage tapes that I gave to my friends, and I went to Kinko's and made zines, and I submitted my fiction to major magazines so that I could be read. And
right.
I hope to get some editor somewhere to like my stuff.
Yeah, and
But
then and then after that, there was like a flowering of the early internet, where independent websites, which were owned by like either petty capitalists or in other kind of non significantly capitalized formats, flourished. But then, obviously, as all kind of capitalist innovations happen, they
Mhm.
were pressed down into what we have now, where 90% of internet traffic goes to a very, very small list of websites, which are all owned by massive for-profit companies, apart from Wikipedia.
Right. Look, if the left has a slew of proposals that would help develop free speech in society. Anti-monopoly laws would help break up the concentration of power into a few private hands, but also the potential to turn most of these big platforms into actually public utilities. There was an effort, or at least it was a suggestion of the Corbyn campaign, and I think maybe the Sanders campaign as well, to develop free internet to
Right. I mean,
expand
the Corbyn proposal
Wi-Fi.
was that internet should be free and that there should be a public social media company. It wasn't about nationalizing Twitter, because how could that work? 'Cause we're not America,
Right, right,
but
right.
rather was to set up like UK book.
Um, right, but something like that would be a step in the right direction for sure. And what was the other thing I was going to say? That I mean, the idea is that free speech is founded on self ownership and empowerment of individuals, and um, when if you're thinking like a Marxist, then you can see that the class distinction, severely limits working class freedom in
I
even
mean,
in
I
terms of
think this it's
speech.
interesting to talk about this, because I think this is the one place, I don't know if you agree, where bourgeois speech, free speech, actually goes too far. In that it's regarded as a right to organize a capitalist company, which then you employ various people to put across your views. And for instance, when a socialist government comes along and limits these rights, they're regarded as engaging in tyranny, in refusing to allow an enormously wealthy person to have an enormously outmoded effect on speech. But I don't think there's anything wrong with kind of banning or removing these sorts of associations if it was done by a socialist government.
Right. It's interesting to right now. I'm running up kind of against a contradiction in society. I think in influencing how I think about these things, because on the one hand, um, you're absolutely right that the concentration of power and capital into a few hands emerges, by default from the commodity production system that we're in, um, limits people's access to the mechanisms of the press, and it limits their ability to be heard. There are a few major newspapers in the past. Just a couple of major social media platforms that really dominate. Um, and but social media is an interesting example. We'll come back to it, but so yeah, you want to do something to give more access to working class people to the press, to being heard, to empower their speech. Putting it into the hands of the state, to the degree to which the people have control over and access to the state might be a help. But I think of the state as, the contemporary state as a capitalist institution in and of itself. It's run
Sure,
off
of
of
course.
the same value as the corporations, and so the worry has been since the Second World War that the kind of liberty that was kind of developed out of competitive capitalism, where everybody could start up their own business and things were not monopolized, um, and and there were lots of crises that came out of that free market moment, has been overcome by the concentration of capital into the state, and so kind of a state capitalist system has emerged. And so when it
You
comes
know,
to what
do you know this kind of MAGA communist idea that we're all living in socialism, which is
yeah.
basically because the anarchy of production was kind of resolved in the late 19th century, that we all were already living in socialism. But you know what's really funny? Um, Marx actually makes fun of this in Volume 3 of Capital, which is probably
Right.
where they got the idea from. But it's very funny that they've just adopted something that Marx made fun of.
Mhm. Well, I don't agree with that we're living in socialism at all. I think we're living under state capitalist system
Yeah, yeah,
largely,
of course.
and that just like any other capitalist system, it's going to be driven by crisis and contradictions and uneven development and the rest. And um, but nonetheless, though, when people like I had Todd McGowan on my podcast recently, and he said, I'm much more worried about corporate power than I am about state power. And he's more worried about how Elon Musk might be changing the discourse than he is about the state. He kind of had to bend on that when I said, we're talking about the Department of Homeland Security here. We're not talking about, NPR or something. We're talking about the police. But the fact is that even with the billionaire class, there's more competition and less concentration of power there than there is in the state, and they don't have the right to use military force or the police to enforce their will, not directly. And I'd rather take on Elon Musk as my opponent than the Department of Homeland Security, in a sense. On the other hand, to the degree to which my country is democratic, I actually have more of an ability to take on the state. So it's just kind
Right.
of a
We're a bit fucked, to be honest.
yeah,
Which is why we're talking about principles, because that's all we have. Well, that's the problem. I
right,
think lots of leftists don't even have principles, or they haven't really thought about them, and so they're in the
right.
position of having really nothing at all apart from kind of like a character. You know, I've forgotten the word, but
Mm.
like an attitude or a perspective. You know, they don't have anything more than that.
For me, I feel like the main task of people who've been like I have been thinking of themselves as part of a left that was aiming for socialism and some sort of radical transformation of society. The main obstacle that we are encountering and the main task that we have, the main obstacle is our lack of an independent political party or movement or even a fully worked out set of principles that's independent. I think for a lot of people, and and now we're in this moment where one of the major tools that we thought we had, or I thought we had, in order to try to develop an independent politics, has been taken or is in the process of being taken away. Like in manufacturing consent, one of the remedies that Chomsky points to when it comes to overcoming the propaganda model that people are living with under is alternative media. And alternative media could be a small business,
And
like
like
the magazine.
structurally, the internet allows for this in so much more ways than any previous other thing.
Right,
Anyone
right,
can type in any URL.
right. And that idea of alternative media as something that's actually an alternative, something that is not being controlled by the state and is not being controlled by what I'll call state corporate power, is dying. It's slowly being strangled, and it it's significant. It's not just significant for me as someone who like is trying to get a business that's I would say is an alternative media business to survive,
Yeah.
but it's important for the left to be able to communicate and talk to one another without state censorship and surveillance. And we are losing that freedom right now, and we've sort of already been lost, but it has also recently been more fully exposed
They're
to the
making it
degree
really
that
obvious now.
yeah,
They're
right,
really like, they're really pushing it. And, and it's not like we're in a situation where they're kind of shy about the idea that they're going to push it more. Like in reaction to this, the Air Force Discord idiot who leaked all the things, they're like, well, clearly we need new laws so that we can somehow remove JPEGs from the entire internet.
to remove JPEGs.
Well,
Is that what
I mean, these particular JPEGs, of
oh,
which
I
many
see.
I have saved on my computer.
Oh, I see. Not just the
And because
form, not the format. Like not everything that's
no,
a
no,
JPEG is on the internet.
these particular JPEGs.
Let's remove
Um,
all vowels from the internet. There are no more vowels allowed.
should we, Varn? Are you free? Should we get Varn on?
Yeah, bring Varn on. Why not?
Varn, message me on Facebook if you're, or if you can do something other than just type.
Yeah. What is Varn saying that made you compelled you to want to bring him in here?
Well, I'm not really sure, and that's why I wanted him on because I think he certainly has something interesting to say here, but I don't quite understand it. And that's more or less the reason I'm interested.
So, like Gilbert May, who is a good friend of mine, colleague of mine, helps me with the pamphlets that we publish. Just said, yes, it's important that. Can we throw that on the screen? The Gilbert
Which one?
May. It says, yes, Doug, it's important. It's from Gilbert. It says point there we go. It says, yes, Doug, it's important, but has always been curtailed. As soon as left-wing organizing is a threat, the capitalist and state will screw you. Well, look, the two
We
things
shouldn't make it worse then.
two things to consider here. The most recent attack on civil society as a whole, not just on left-wing organizing, wasn't prompted by left-wing organizing alone. In fact, the real excuse they used the Department of Homeland Security used, the actual excuse, was the was Russiagate, was the idea that Russia had attacked America's electoral infrastructure.
Right.
And the Department of Homeland Security's response to that was to claim jurisdiction across all states over the entirety of our electoral infrastructure, which included the entirety of our information infrastructure. That means all of the major media, all of the internet companies, as well. And so, how much control they've actually been able to exert is definitely going to be limited, but it's less limited than we think, and it's growing all the time. And it's growing particularly in a domain that that people might not have anticipated if they were naive like I was, which is it's grown as a systematic attempt at censorship and control of the narrative on the entirety of the internet, down to our direct messages to one another. Those can
Right.
be censored now and have been already. If you tried to send a link to the Hunter Biden laptop story on the New York Post through Facebook,
No, I mean I know this
that
because
was censored.
I try to engage with like a lot of edgy Turkish communist and Kurdish revolutionary stuff, and I
Mhm.
found out when I tried to send a link to the website of the TKP, which is a Turkish Maoist party, it was blocked by Facebook as if it was like a spam ad or something. Like it used the
Right.
same functionalities there.
I
Oh,
mean, if they
Varn.
were targeting, hey Varn, if they were targeting just individual left organizations in some like COINTELPRO way, I would be absolutely outraged, and most of the left would be absolutely outraged, and there would be people would stand up to defend their friends and comrades, but this is a whole of society effort
Right.
that sweeps in people from all sorts of political
So
persuasions
I
and
guess
ideas.
this is your point for why liberals should really care about it, not just us freaks.
Yeah, everybody who cares about living in some sort of relative freedom should care about this particular issue. So, Derek, what were you saying that you think? Use your psychic powers to figure out why Stefan brought you on here. What were you raising that needs to be raised?
I just really
I
like the
was I
idea of
was
having someone in the chat and then bringing them on.
I love that too. Yeah.
uh, so one of the things that you and I have been kind of going back and forth on this for a long time is that there are pretty big ways in which, both in principle and in legality, um, the state can utilize contradictions in both our law and our case law and in the principles themselves to effectively censor. Now, you are right civilly that this does introduce entwinement. The problem with entwinement is it's not actually a constitutional principle. It's a matter of case law, which means it could also easily be reversed. Um,
Right,
and this
but
is
the Constitutional foundation for protecting speech would be much more difficult to reverse, and the concept of entwinement is just trying to determine who is a state actor or not. So, I mean, and it's always a battle to demonstrate in court that there's been actual entwinement. When I looked into the examples, it was relatively rare that the plaintiffs won in those cases, but they did happen. And when it did happen,
yeah
it happened like the one example I found was in 1958 around civil rights. And it was whether or not someone who was keeping a black man from eating at a diner was acting as a state actor and violating federal law in the process. I think this is roughly it. And in that instance, they found for the plaintiff, and I think they found for the plaintiff partly because of their neutral interpretation of the law, but also because there was a massive movement to protect uh, the civil rights of Black Americans that was impacting the way that the courts understood the law. So that's
yeah
why it's so important to talk to people who are activists and radicals on the left about this issue, because if they don't see this as a part of a basic expansion of freedom and protection of civil rights, but only see this as a right-wing issue, then we're much more likely to lose this freedom. The left actually does matter. We can have an impact. We have incredible power in the way that we're influencers, or as in the terms of the disinformation cops, we're the spreaders. So,
well, there's a couple problems with the disinformation thing that we have to deal with. One is when so much that they're actually censoring speech by using protocols that have been enabled by these private corporations, and enforcing the protocols as written. You're going to have a hard time actually fighting that as a case of entwinement, because
but they're actually helping them write the terms of service. They're telling them in advance what kinds of things to look out for and to put into their terms of service. The example of the Ukraine.
I've told you this has been allowed in the U.S. since the 1920s, particularly under wartime. And under wartime, Doug, which we're not at now. So what?
Are we?
Are we? We're at war with Ukraine. Sorry, Russia.
But we're in Ukraine with Russia.
We are not. We're not at war, and that does legally matter, because if you actually invoke wartime powers, it actually freezes even constitutional powers. Like habeas corpus has been suspended during wartime. So the reason why it does matter is Congress is supposed to declare it. It hasn't since the Policing Powers Act in the 1950s in the charter with the UN, giving a kind of backdoor to start a war. But what that does mean as well is that the government has some limitations. This has gotten more complicated post-Patriot Act, as you well know, because some war powers are now essentially permanently ensconced in our society through actual legal deference, and they've been constitutionally upheld. I am the Twitter files debacle, and I do think it's ultimately been a debacle, and it's been a debacle partly because of people in it. I don't mean Taibbi on this count either. I actually mean that Elon Musk has been remarkably hard to predict and unprincipled.
He's gone really back and forth on it, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was for it until he was against it.
Right, exactly.
And I wonder if one of the reasons that Musk might be against it is because his lawyers are pointing out to him that whatever legal exposure might have arisen during the previous ownership hasn't gone away just because he bought the company. He's as liable as they were. So if there were to be,
that seems likely. But guys, I didn't want you to argue about the Twitter files. So, Vaughn,
damn it! That's my favorite thing to argue about. Go ahead.
Could you introduce to the audience kind of a brief gloss on kind of Marx's thoughts about free speech? Because obviously he was a journalist in his early life, wrote about censorship in the Prussian state and with the 1848 revolutions and so on.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, his first writings are actually primarily on censorship, and he was against censorship his whole life, from what I can tell. However, in later life, he started to be really concerned, and you see this actually a lot in Engels's writing about this later, about the fact that free speech was not completely possible as long as there was a maintenance of the illusion of private property. And I say illusion here because in a lot of these scenarios, ironically, interestingly, the reason why civil law matters so much more than, say, constitutional principle is that if it's not private, and particularly under American law, it's actually more subject to state intervention. But nonetheless, and I'll get to why this is an interesting contradiction, Marx was just pointing out, in principle, if everyone doesn't have a printing press, then then there still will be de facto censorship in society through the ownership of the means of communication and its production.
Yeah, but we've been discussing that, right? I mean, and in terms of yes, within the state, if you're working for a state agency, they can impose all sorts of restrictions on your speech as a member of that agency. Sure, but if the state, as a private citizen, you're protected from state censorship. That's the point of the Constitution. the
But
First Amendment.
as a different point of the Constitution, the regulation of what happens between states and the regulation of interstate commerce on public grounds is actually constitutionally allowed, which is why things like the FCC exist. Because under a purist view of the First Amendment, I actually don't know how you justify the existence of the FCC, because it does censor. And we also know about, and I brought this up to you before, we also know about the collusion between state and corporation going all the way back to the pressures that led to the Hays Code, of which government actors were explicitly giving them guidance on what was and was not privately acceptable through the Hays Code. And we know the most about this during World War II. Mm-hmm. Which is why, if you watch movies before 1935, they're like weirdly anti-Soviet. After 1935, they're super pro-Soviet, and then they punished everybody for making those movies in the 1950s, even though the government encouraged it in lieu of the war. And they did through private channels, and it's never been deemed unconstitutional for them to do so.
Right. I mean, I've been reading about the FCC. The I guess if we're going to pretend to be like, and hell, I'm really tempted. Part of me, I've been, I don't know if everyone knows this, but I had when I left Zero, there was talk of litigation, and I feel like I've been threatened with lawsuits enough now that I should maybe sue someone.
You got the right to be outwarned.
I should do it. But if I were to threaten to sue someone, it would be, hell, for fun, for shits and giggles, it would be fun to go after Elon Musk, right? Why not? But I'm just kidding, Elon. But
so to what degree did Marx think we could have free speech under a bourgeois republican state? Because I think, like Lenin in State and Revolution, Marx did think that the bourgeois republic was the best place for socialists to be.
Yeah, he does. I mean, I think Marx thinks that the contrary. This is where I'm not arguing against Doug. I just want to pose the problems here in a more complicated way. The contradictions in bourgeois society created by bourgeois notions of right actually enable a space of which socialists could act where they can't in like totally autocratic societies. That the illusion of the separation between the public private sphere, and it is an illusion, does enable us to actually push back against the state in a way that you just can't legally do in an autocracy.
It's a real illusion, like Daniel Dennett says.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does matter. Like, for example, when we were talking about the nitty-gritty of bourgeois law in the United States, and the other complication for this is an international problem. This is not a national problem, so it can't totally be settled by U.S. constitutional law. And that is something that I worry about, because what we increasingly see from about 2010 onward is state actors trying to utilize these companies. And it's not, the U.S. is a big one. I mean, Russiagate's a stupid one, but one that has a tiny thread of truth, because states can act in this sphere and use their own legal codes to do so, and international treaty to do so. So that means that we're in a morass. And like somebody said, the Hays Code is way better than what we have now. That's absolutely correct, because it was only one government doing it to one media industry. The British government did it to its media industry, and it would just keep ours out. But it can't do that anymore. Like, the material capacity for that to be done is really hard. They can't even totally do it in a place where there's a lot more control. Even North Korea occasionally has stuff sneak in. So this has become a contested space, and it's one where I worry that we're all also caught up between state actors acting against each other and trying to control information. And this gets really, really hazy with all these, state affiliated things. I mean, one of the things I will say that I will give Musk credit for is I actually like that he put state affiliated media on NPR.
Yeah.
Because it is. Like,
I feel like it can be hazy, but our task here is to clear away as much of the haze as we can. And it's worth noting that the FCC is a regulatory body that at least gave a nod to the U.S. Constitution in its formation. And you could go on Fox News, and you could say on Fox News that China's released the virus as a bioweapon, right? And there was not going to be that broadcast wasn't going to be taken down. But if you went on social media and said that, your text will be taken down, based not on some transparently put together and stated regulation, but based on the whims of the Department of Homeland Security or the CDC or the network of NGOs that were working for them. So
our private corporations who want to devote any research or research into monitoring their own brand can do this, and that is
but that's like
a reality.
That a publisher has the right to publish what he likes, and that's true. That that at the level when you start talking about what different networks decide that they want to publish, you really aren't talking about censorship anymore. What the point is, like on social media, each individual user is a publisher, right? So when you censor them, you're censoring the press, you're censoring the free press.
See, legally, however, that has not been adjudicated, that each individual is an individual publisher. The law as written, and the one that actually protects us in some cases from civil liability, actually says that we're not publishers.
That's wrong. The companies aren't publishers. The social media companies aren't considered publishers. They're not. They're the ones who are not liable. Well,
but we are not considered publishers either.
I think that Alex Jones getting sued for what he said on social media and on his radio program demonstrates that he wasn't protected from liability, but because he was using a social media platform.
I know that Brits certainly aren't, as I'm sure you've all seen people having to publish like groveling replies to J.K. Rowling.
I don't think there's any legal protection from libel or any.
No, there's not legal protection for us from libel. But what I was saying is there's been no court decision saying that we are, as individual users, actively acting as press.
Yeah, but press isn't even a legal press isn't.
You're right.
Legal I don't need to be officially some legally incorporated press. I am a person, and as a person, I have the constitutional right to free speech. And if I want to write something down on a piece of paper and stick it on a tree, or go to Kinko's and publish print up 100,000 copies, or pay a printing press to print 100,000 copies, I, as a free citizen, have that right. And I also have the right to work with others in an organization which we determine has a certain kind of structure, and has a brand and has a mission, and to publish based on those principles. But all of that, none of that is particularly complicated. I mean, it sounds complicated, but it isn't. The point is that the people who are on the hook for their speech online are the people posting, not the companies, and they therefore are publishing their work online. Creators at YouTube certainly are.
I don't want us to argue about the law.
Yeah, I was about to say we can get into the nitty-gritty of the law here, but it's also specific to social media platforms and the internet, because the removal of one clause in the Telecommunications Act of 1996 would actually completely change all of it, and it's the one clause that both parties want to get rid of.
Well, I think what was going on for a while was that they were arguing. They would be telling people, they told Zuckerberg, you have to do something about this information, or this one line is going to go away, which would completely destroy the Facebook's company. It would just destroy Facebook to have that change.
Right. Because it opens up a whole different responsibility under civil law. And this is where the public-private Marxist distinction really kicks in.
The reason I brought up Jones, I want to talk to this comment, is Jones was sued for libel, rightly, but he was sued, which means that he wasn't protected from litigation as a non-publisher.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely correct there. There's a whole lot of vagaries here. I mean, just in the law too, like public versus private individual is a legally constituted distinction, although it's not particularly well defined, because public, like for example, being famous versus not being famous is itself a protection for libel. Like if you're famous, you should expect it.
Right.
It's like considered part of, and that's legally set out in multiple countries,
which is,
too.
I think, is fair enough, because I think that makes a certain amount of sense that people who are celebrities and in the kind of public entities at that point have to withstand satirical writings and all sorts of humiliations that your everyday private person doesn't.
That's the fucking cost,
right.
Dickhead.
Yeah. I mean, my thing about my issue right here is not that I disagree with you in principle, is that I think the government's own legal apparatus is going to be something we have to fight harder on. And maybe this is actually to support your point, but it's because it's actually unclear at points in the law. And we have plenty of historical case law that goes in both directions.
Right. I don't want to overstate what my legal knowledge is here, but I have been looking into it a little bit, because of this fantasy about suing Elon Musk. So, but it's worth exploring. But I do think underscoring the point that by my understanding of what legal speech amounts to, legal speech, constitutionally protected speech, was censored online by state actors, and not just once or twice, but millions of times. And when Google decides that they're going to put into their terms of service that you can be taken down based on your political opinions about a war in Ukraine, that is a major infringement upon our civil liberties. It's not minor. It's huge, because that's saying the public doesn't have the right to discuss or think about the war in Ukraine outside of the government's sanctioned narrative.
Well, I mean, you still have plenty of right to discuss it. You just don't have a right to discuss it on that platform, which is a problem.
Yeah.
But if say Facebook decided to do that without government intervention, it's still legal. And they have in the past too. Like they've done it without government prompting as well.
What was the political speech that Google was banning in the past?
I'm not so much Google, although there's plenty of it. There's, like, for example, you can't touch certain topics at all. If you bring up Nazis at all, even to fight Nazis, you're going to automatically be censored by Google.
Yeah.
If you bring up certain things about China, you're going to automatically be censored by Google. Or if you bring up certain things about, say, U.S. intelligence, they're probably going to censor you, and they're not going to do it because the U.S. government asked them. They also do it because they want to protect advertisers. And so that right there is a vagary that makes this very hard to deal with, because if we're arguing this on principle, we have to go broader than just saying, oh, our constitutional protections are what we need to fight here. We need to be fighting for free speech in principle beyond even what is stated in.
Okay, I agree with you, but the problem is that we've come so far now that we no longer are able to stand up when the constitutional protected speech is being overturned, when the constitutional right is being overturned itself. It's not that I'm saying this is the limit of how far we should go. I'm saying this is the line which we cannot allow to be crossed.
So I'm gonna to take it to what I consider the biggest threat to this right now, which is maybe different than you, but I think it's really coming up, is the Restrict Act.
Oh yeah, no,
where national security interests are going to be used to pull down private platforms pretty much
Does that
at
still
the
have
whim
legs?
of the Secretary of Commerce. Yes, it's just been in committee. They're just hoping we forget it, but it had overwhelming congressional support. That's the thing. It doesn't have overwhelming public support, but it has overwhelming congressional support. This is going to be a test case if public support matters. And I just want to point out, historically, it generally hasn't.
I think
Well, not
it is
immediately, right? Not immediately.
I think it is interesting to think what will happen if one day you can't use TikTok anymore, and what that will trigger in people. If it'll be anything significant, people just move on.
I mean, we already have this potentially at a state level in one U.S. state now. I do not believe the governor, as of last time I checked, had signed the bill, but it's passed. And this is where, for all of our non-American audience, I really am sympathetic, because right now there's a whole lot of the of the world access to these devices that depend on three polities, basically China, the greater EU, and the US, and we are in our battles actually setting the tone for most of the planet. And
we'll have to rely on the less censorious China.
No, God.
So I mean, it does seem like right now we're in a I do think there's a clear and present danger. And there's been a clear and present danger all the way back to the Patriot Act. And one of the things that I have been kind of quietly more concerned with than the kinds of things that maybe we've talked about on Twitter or whatever is that so much of this has just been totally normalized and internalized at this point. Like Patriot Act provisions are just de rigueur now. The fact that substantive due process is pretty much gone, also for different reasons. I mean, that has to do with Roe v. Wade, but it has implications for speech too.
I just want to,
because you start
I just want to completely back you about the Restrict Act, because one of the things, if you take a look at the Department of Homeland Security and their relationships with all these social media companies and media companies, one of the things that still could exist in this system is the possibility of something like Substack or another platform that didn't have those relationships, right? That where they would at least have to make an effort to impose themselves on those institutions. There are still parts of the internet which are not, they're not the major ones, but they're these little pockets. And if you give the Restrict Act to the government, they can just throw those platforms away. They can just say, no, based on you're not colluding with the Department of Homeland Security, not participating in our war and disinformation. You are an enemy combatant, and we are, that they wouldn't say enemy combatant, but they could just toss them off the internet.
The secretary. So now this is not me speaking as legal expert. Do not take legal expert from
this is not legal advice.
But if you'd like to send Derek $50, he'd be glad to talk to you on the phone and advise you about your upcoming court appearance. Go ahead.
But what I will say is that I am particularly worried about it because its language is particularly vague. And while there are other laws in the U.S. system that would mean that a U.S. citizen who got accused of being a foreign entity would have a constitutionally protected day in court, the provisions actually are really vague as to how that goes about, since all of it is also undisclosable. And another thing that it does, which I don't think people quite realize, is the Restrict Act puts permanent limits on freedom of information. So you can't make a FISA request on these things because they're matters of national security and thus beyond FISA's request. And it doesn't seem like they're going to have a statute of limitations on this.
And if they did, it wouldn't matter that much because there was a statute of limitation on the Patriot Act. Remember, it just kept getting reinstated.
It's been reinstated 4 times? Yeah. So with that in mind, I mean, we talk about this in terms of principle. I do think that maybe if you want to get younger people to understand this, putting together all the implications of what banning TikTok means because it's not, as you and I both know, TikTok is actually not mentioned in the act. Like, yes, there are states that are, but a state that does that is opening up to a federal lawsuit that under both interstate and national commerce that would make it undone. Whereas if you make it a matter of legal national security, all the like world trade courts and whatnot don't apply to it anymore, and that's going to be a pretty big fucking deal. And I'm not feeling optimistic that that won't pass in some form. Now, like I said, the bill that I read, which was all 51 pages of it, which is actually kind of short.
Yeah.
The Patriot Act was like 2,000 pages.
Well, we're all illiterate now.
May not be the bill that we get, and that bill was vague AF on some key points, so it would be settled by case law. Once again, case law rearing its ugly fucking head. But I do think a left in America needs to be very serious about how it deals with these platforms, because there has been a tendency of liberals to sound like libertarians on matters of private law because they see this as benefiting them.
Right.
What do you mean? Am I sounding like that, or who sounds like that?
No. You're not. I'm not accusing you of being liberal for once, Doug Lain. Normally, I would just out and out call you a liberal idealist. No, I mean, like, for example, from everything from Bellingcat to
Bellingcat. Those, how the fuck can they call themselves journalists? They're like professional tattletales.
Well, here's the thing that I've noticed since the 1990s is basically we don't need state media very much in the United States because journalists are incredibly lazy, and the private journalist will just become stenographers for tweets and the government anyway. But which is a whole different problem. I mean, one of the problems in the United States right now is
that shows you're the winning country, right? You only have to directly censor when you're losing, which I think is a bad sign for the United States as an empire.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the other thing, isn't it? In some sense, when we talk about these state-informed medias and all this is just a chicken coming home to roost. Like it's not that any one state can completely take out the U.S. media apparatus or whatever, but it is pretty clear that states can now compete with it, including fairly poor ones. It's not just Israel and Europe anymore, and China. Now, like, I mean, Bolivia, if it wanted to, could probably run a decent counter information campaign. So that you're right. I mean, Stefan's right. Like the context of U.S. imperialism and its shift from global hegemon into probably regional hegemon is part of this, and it's also just interesting. We do have to deal with this. That the nature of the state apparatus is really concerned about the perception of liberality. Now, I point this out a lot, that our state apparatus is like, they use January 6th to justify all kinds of stuff. They're going to our state apparatus, however, has largely not changed policies that much since, I mean, there's been as I pointed out to you in our conversation on Chris Cutrone's Why Not Trump, there's been a remarkable continuity in government policy between Obama, Trump, Biden. There has not been a remarkable continuity about the way each of those administrations handled government officials, though. Like, that's one of the breaks.
Can we address? I've got to run here in just a minute. I put aside an hour for this, but Simon Gross, I think is how you say his name, who has written about me recently in an academic journal. I get alerts from some academic journal that whenever my name is mentioned, and he wrote about how in Monstrous, Todd McGowan and I were in a podcast about where we said Ukraine wouldn't have been invaded if it wasn't invadable, as an example of some concept. So he thought we were monstrous about that. But he's saying here, so let's see, what is it? Where it keeps going away. Something like, so are we in? Yeah. So how is media bad now? Are we in Trump land where the deep state and fake news are enemies? And I just want to say, like, the idea of a deep state was not originally a right-wing notion.
It's a really, really big thing among the Turkish left.
Yeah, and
I don't know if it originated there, but
I mean, it certainly goes back to at least COINTELPRO days to be opposed to the FBI and the CIA, and they generally have tended to target socialists and communists. These operatives. So it's not Trump land.
I mean, they did also target Nazis, but they.
Yeah. Okay.
But
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Let's just always play devil's advocate whenever Doug's talking. So yeah. I know. And but no. But they did, of course. But that wouldn't be why that wouldn't be first on my list of reasons to dislike the FBI. But also the media. Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. There's been a long-standing critique of corporate media on the left. The idea that we should just embrace the corporate news as some great and the people who work for them as great defenders of what left principles of social emancipation, socialism, what have you, is absurd. So you can say, yeah, I don't like MSNBC, and I don't like the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is training them on what to report and not be in Trump land. And the idea that we would be in Trump land by saying that just gives every kind of act of dissident resistance and the idea that we could live in a better society than this one away to reactionaries like Trump. I mean, do we want Trump to be the only people, the Trump supporters be the only ones who are saying, hey, we're being lied to, when it's becoming clear that we're being lied to? I don't think so. But thanks for writing about me, though, Simon. Yeah, I should go.
Okay,
go.
I wanted to talk about the government keeping secrets from us, which is the topic of Ben's recent article. But if Varn can stay around, I can talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for having me on, guys. Varn, it was always. I'm sorry if I talked over you. I'm always just worried you're gonna put in some little point and make me look the fool when I'm. Oh, I know I'm right on this one.
Doug only talks over you because he fears your power.
That's right. I'm censoring you. Because I'm weak.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Doug
is the United States and I'm China. That's how this is going out.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, Doug.
Bye.
So recently, Ben published an article in the Daily Beast talking about the insane right-wing Discord guy. I don't know if he's insane. He's probably, as right-wing guys on Discord go, probably relatively sane. But I think it brings up an interesting point if we want to talk about principles, which is to reverse from talking about what the government should allow us to say and what the government should do about private entities in regards to speech, but to ask what the government has to say to us in terms of what secrets can the state keep from us. And I think I would agree with Ben that what was revealed in these documents, it's good that it was revealed. But at the same point, I feel like the state should be able to keep some secrets. That the state doesn't need to give us a minute-by-minute update on their military operations, but that we should know in general that, for instance, US troops are deployed in Ukraine. But I'm not quite sure how to work that out into a proper principle.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, on one hand, there's a natural drift anytime you invoke national security that it's going to be invoked for more and more things. I mean, like, most actual government conspiracies exist to cover up incompetence. Like, that's where you tend to find actually real historically existing government conspiracies. There are, wag the dog scenarios. There are things that are designed to trick people into war. We do, we know about the Gulf of Tonkin, but it is remarkable how few of those we know about historically, because and the ones we do is because most people can't keep their mouth shut about them. Like, someone's gonna
right, some fucking guy from Delta Force will tell you about all the cool conspiracies he was in.
Right. I mean, and basically that's what happened here, right? Like, you know, some 21-year-old leaked a bunch of papers, and
right?
one of
To
the problems that we
look
have with
cool.
this is, yeah, one of the problems we have with this is so much is classified now, that also, so that people can even do their fucking jobs, so many people have classified clearance.
I mean, I think it really reveals
Like,
something about the U.S. state structures. That what was this guy? What state was he from? Maine. So he was from
yeah,
the Maine National Guard Air Force. Which, first off, why does that exist? And then he was from the Maine National Guard Air Force Intelligence Unit. Which is why does that
in case we ever
exist?
have a civil war again, that's, you know. Yes, yes. I mean, you know, well, I mean, Texas maintains its constitutional right to have its own army. So, you know, I know Europeans, like, you're just like, wait, what? Like, yes, that, you know, that's what the Texas Rangers effectively are. Yeah, over a million people. That's like what, one, that would be one
300-ish.
300 and 320th of the population has high level government
So you'll
clearance,
see one.
which
You'll see
just,
one every time you like walk down the street for half an hour.
yeah, which means, it kind of doesn't mean, like, it makes it very hard for me to know what the government's even doing at this point, like, because, like, it can't tell what's a classified document or not. We have the fact that, like, we know at least two presidents have absconded with classified documents. I have a strange feeling that if we were consistent and went through everyone's presidential library notes all the way back to Clinton, that all of them would be littered with stuff that's
It's
technically
almost
classified
impossible
and
for them
should
not to
be
be, right? It's like if they just,
right.
if you write out his daily schedule honestly, then there'd be 8
Right.
classified things in there. And it
Right.
was interesting looking at these documents, which I did look at quite a few of them. A lot of them were just kind of republications of open source media, which was then given to kind of government officials who want to know about the war in Ukraine but don't really know much about the situation. Like the apparent like secret revealing of Russian casualties was just a reprint of Ukrainian Ministry of Defense figures. And the number of tanks and vehicles destroyed from Russia was not, again, some secret magic number of internal American stuff, but was rather just taken from Twitter. It was taken from this guy on Twitter called Orex.
Ugh. Yeah, I've been trying to. I mean, one of the things about this to me when it comes to like these war scenarios, and there's been a whole lot of uh, concerns I have about all of it. Like for example, we've known, it's been public knowledge since I think at least the middle of last year, that there were U.S. advisors sent into
Yeah, the
Ukraine,
Intercept
and
reported in October.
yeah, and it's like, yes, it's finally making it to social media, like
Yeah.
now, you know, April, a year later. um it's one of the interesting things is, like, I've always worried about information overload, that like, there's so much information now, people can't
Yeah,
contextualize it, know
certainly.
what's really a threat, what isn't. But I'm also now thinking that's true with the fucking, like, government
Oh,
itself.
yeah.
Like, no one actually knows anything. Like, there's so much information, so many classified things that, like, you can very easily go to prison for doing a stunt, but that probably happens all the
Yeah, I
time.
mean, the Ukrainian
Um,
government has been refusing throughout the war to give the US deep details of what they're doing. And probably because
right.
they exactly expected this sort of thing, because they have some people, some real cold-blooded people in their organization who understand how the US works and realize that anything they tell to the US will be told to 10,000 people who have an addiction to leaking stuff to the New York Times, and it'll all come out. Like recently, it was in the Times, I think. Ukraine managed to keep it very, very secret that they launched a military operation at the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, including firing HIMAR missiles a few hundred meters from the reactor. They managed to keep this incredibly suppressed, and only through reading like dodgy Russian stuff would you even know the attack has happened. And then a few days ago, it was published in the Times with exact details, detailing the whole thing. because some American advisors that were nearby just had to talk to journalists about it.
Right. And when it comes to international law, it's just as complicated. Someone's bringing up the U.S. refuses to give details to the International Criminal Court. Yeah, it doesn't have to. It's not a signatory. I mean, like, it does so
that
on a
was the most
voluntary
fucking
basis.
ridiculous thing, charging Putin from the ICC.
Yeah, that's. I mean, like, look, the ICC is technically there to enforce the international the International Declaration of Human Rights, which nobody. I've read them. I used to teach them to students. Nobody actually follows those things. I can't find a nation on earth that is not guilty of violating at least one of the International Declarations of Human Rights, which the U.S. knew when it helped draft them, but then deliberately refused to be a signatory to the International Criminal Court from moment one. Like, from the moment of inception, we've been like, yeah, we'll write it, but we're not going to actually do it. I mean,
fantastic peak American exceptionalism. It's like
right.
when they complained about Iran not obeying the nuclear deal after the US stopped obeying the nuclear deal.
Yeah, it's just like, and I mean, and all this, not to get too distracted on these things. Like, yeah, I also think that like, I don't know that we would be necessarily benefited from knowing where all the troop movements were everywhere in the world at any given time. Like, at the same token, I do worry about how much is classifiable, and like, since like,
I think we should understand in general what the state is doing.
Right. Like, and look, trying to deduce a principle as to what the line is seems very, very hard. Like, I guess we could say, does it endanger lives? But when you do that, I can tell you that's exactly what they did with all the Assange leaks. Is like, well, there's lives in danger. And I'm like, well,
yeah, they'll keep it secret until
like,
every single one of those people have died.
Right.
Like, with regards to the Ben Burgess stuff, he obviously got a lot of insane replies from people who are bots or who have had their minds fried so badly they may as well be bots. And the point a lot of them were making was basically that this leak is immoral because by leaking intelligence on Russian stuff, it gives vague hints to Russia about who their informants are, and thus that might get kind of CIA operatives in Russia in trouble. And etc., which they framed in terms of that being anti-imperialist. It's anti-imperialist for the CIA to spy on Russia because they're invading Ukraine, which is fantastic ideological stuff. But yeah, these ideas can be very, very easily abused if we talk about harm. As we discussed almost at the start of the episode, that these concepts are used so broadly that they can be used to bar basically the dissemination of anything.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a conservative, but the expansion of harm in both general legal principle and in left-wing discourse has made it almost a useless term. Which is why, like I said, okay, maybe we could invoke like a harm principle, but we can't, because indirectly you can link, like, I can link anything to like 2 steps down the chain from like us discussing this right now could somehow probably.
Well, I mean, every time you leak a secret document, some office worker who works for the CIA gets really stressed. Some neurodivergent guy who works for the CIA gets really stressed and anxious.
And one of them has a heart attack, and then we can claim, or they have anxiety.
And really, these people are very close to suffering from mass psychosis, as we saw with the Havana syndrome.
Oh God. Yeah, so yeah, harm principles aren't helpful here. So
yeah, we should pack it in.
Yeah.
I did want to answer before. It's a question from ages ago. Someone was asking about what Turkish left I meant. Definitely not the CHP, who are the people who might win the presidency. They're Kemalists, nothing of the left. But the discourse around the deep state, as I understood it, I don't know if this is the actual origin of it, originated from the Turkish communist left, which is now associated with the Kurdish movement, because they had a big thing. What was that operation where they did this, the stay behind guys expecting a Soviet invasion?
Oh, yeah, I don't remember the name of it, but I know what you're talking about.
That thing. Obviously, those people were basically unleashed after they realized that there wasn't going to be a Soviet invasion, and they very famously engaged in all sort of terrorism in Italy, but also less known in the West is they engaged in
Gladio.
Gladio.
It's
The
Gladio.
Gladio operatives engaged in insane, massive violence in Turkey, and that they're these kind of deep state operatives. For instance, or like they're heroes among, and then 15 people have floated Gladio in chat. These people are heroes among like Turkish nationalists on the Turkish right. A real creep who murdered a lot of leftists and Kurds in the 70s and 80s and 90s. He was recently put up on a banner by football ultras in Turkey in order to provoke the kind of leftist Kurdish fans of the opposite team. So for me, that's what the deep state. That was my introduction to the deep state, and now, yeah,
my introduction was the counter revolution in Egypt, because not that I'm necessarily a big fan of the Brotherhood, but they really were like the agents of the old government who were still in government, even though they were subsumed to the Brotherhood government. They fucked things up. Like they really would actively like not deliver on stuff. The military sat on its hands all the time. Public and it was kind of a state within a state that was able to make the government dysfunctional and give grounds for the military to reassert itself. A year later, which it did. I mean, like in spades. So I mean, like, I think that's real. It's the thing. I will admit, it's a fuzzy concept. Like,
right. I mean,
but it
earlier
is
Jordan said the shallow state, which I think is interesting in the US context. That there is kind of, is it even a deep state, or is it so kind of obvious that there are all these extra congressional powers, that the US isn't a democracy in the sense that it's operated instead by the CIA and direct executive power and so on. Should we talk about a deep state, or like a shallow, obvious state, which also then gets into the point that while the deep part of it, I think, is the fact that the Pentagon and the CIA are the bits of the US state which are functional and expanding, while the rest of the US state, the actual democratic parts of it, which are controlled by popular vote, like around healthcare and things like this, and welfare, are continually shrinking and not becoming non-functioning and so on.
And in so much that we have any of those services, we have them through the military. In so much that we have almost any research done, it's done through the military.
The last progressive power in the world, in the US, is the Maine State Air Force Intelligence Unit.
I mean, but I've been referring to them as like the secret Caesar that no one wants to look at, because I'm like, when everyone talks about, like, you remember 2 years ago when everybody in the liberal media sphere in the United States, maybe you don't, luckily you don't live here, you live in another hellhole, different one though. So when everyone's talking about civil war, and I'm just like, do you think the US military is just going to sit there and let the Chuds and the Antifa kill themselves forever? I mean, they might for a little while, but you think you're going to do it for a long period of time? No. And you think, like, right, the fact that they have
you were completely right.
Yeah, AR-15s matters to that? No. You like drone cluster bomb. Done. Like, city block gone. And
a real deep cut of mine is that there could never be a successful revolution in the United States, because in the United States, your houses aren't made of stone and concrete; they're made of wood. And so, with a single like incendiary bomb, you can destroy like hundreds of thousands of homes in the US. While in somewhere like Syria, which were built by like Soviet technicians, their tower blocks, you can hit them with basically anything short of a nuclear bomb, and you can still keep fighting inside them.
Yeah, an irony is that, like, the rich countries, because we hoard all the wood and like high grade paper, like a lot of your houses are made of high grade paper. They're not even really like wood planks anymore, my friends. It's high grade paper and sheetrock. Interestingly, means that, like, our houses are not are burnable, whereas like if you're in, I don't know, even like northern Mexico, those things are made out of cinder blocks.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more actually resistant. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a thing that I just find sort of ludicrous because it's kind of an open secret, and stuff like this kind of reminds us. And I want to maybe I want to make people a little bit like, I'm gonna sound like Doug here, maybe a little bit. Is that you're absolutely right that in the U.S. political life right now, the actual parts of the government that are democratic, which is like local government, uh, the House of Representatives, etc., are all deeply dysfunctional, and also have had more and more of their power they have actively themselves given to avoid responsibility in elections to other parts of the administrative state. And even liberals tend to celebrate this. One of the biggest principles in liberal jurisprudence right now, even from like the far left of liberalism, like you listen to the 5-4 Supreme Court podcast, they really want to protect the administrative state as the manifestation of popular sovereignty. And I have to like point out, like, but it's not. It is explicitly not popularly sovereign.
Wait, is
like,
that a podcast?
It might
the
do
5-4 podcast?
Yeah, 5-4 podcast.
Did they not rename it
like
6-3 or whatever the current state is?
No, they didn't. They should actually. But it's just it's the U.S. government right now. The only parts of it that work are the non-democratic parts, and this is why I think like politics seems so insane in most of the West, and including not just in the United States, is because people are more politically invested than ever, and they have no political power or even means of political participation anymore. Like this is true in the UK too. Like what the like the Tories could probably shoot 25 people in the street and stay in power right now. Like, so like, yeah, I think we're just in this time period where that's really the case where we're at. And so I'm agreeing with Dub, but part of me just feels like on all these things it's maybe too little too late.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's being pushed on is exactly the reason why you say we now live in a multipolar world for good and ill. And that just means that a lot of people who've been like, social media was given a lot of laxitude when we were the only people in control of it.
Right.
Like,
I'm just waiting for China to get serious about like propagandizing in the West. Because right now their English language content barely passes the Turing test. But we are definitely not talking about principles of free speech. I will also say that I do think there could be a revolution in the US. I was being facile, but it will obviously come from the US, a large part of the US Army being alongside the revolutionaries. But we're definitely not talking about free speech anymore, though we should talk about the things we're talking about in future. So let's knock off. Goodbye, everyone.
Yep.
Oh, wait.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to play the outro. Bye.